Hello, good evening. Welcome to this one-day UVA virtual talk series. My name is Susan Lynch. I am the Associate Director of Lifetime Learning at the University of Virginia's Office of Engagement. We are so pleased to have all of you join us this evening. This is the fourth Crafting Cocktails event that we've hosted. It's turned into a bit of a series, and so I'm so pleased to see familiar names and faces, so welcome back. And wonderful to see new names and faces as well. So we are fortunate to have Suzanne Moomaw with us again this evening. She is the director of the University of Virginia Press. She will introduce us to UVA Press and to Micah LeMon, our main speaker. Micah will answer questions submitted before and during the program. You may enter a question in the chat box below. Please add your name and UVA affiliation. You will find resources in the Zoom chat as well. Please also note that this program is being recorded and will be posted in Lifetime Learning's podcast library. You will also find recordings of our other cocktail programs in our podcast library, so you might want to check those out as well. Please note that you can always change the view of the speaker and the participants in the Zoom session by going to the upper right-hand corner of your screen and clicking on the icon to change the view. You might want to switch to speaker view to make sure that you can see Micah's demonstrations a little bit better. So again, we are so pleased to have you join us this evening, and to get us started, I'm going to pass the program over to Suzanne. So please take it away, Suzanne.
Thank you, Susan. I'm delighted to be here representing UVA Press. UVA Press is the scholarly press of the university. We are 60 years old, and over that time, we've published 2,000 books in the humanities, biographies, architecture, and local and Virginia culture, which brings us to Micah LeMon and his book, Bible, published by UVA Press in 2017. Micah's craft has put a stamp not just on terrific cocktails, but on the cultural experience of understanding and enjoying cocktails. His approach takes us from spirits to bitters to ice, and that journey introduces us to a world of new adventures. His creativity at the Alley Light Bar has affected the palates of people in the Commonwealth and across the globe, for the better, I might say. We would welcome you to order Micah's book or any other UVA Press books at a 30% discount. The code is in the chat if you like. The inside flap of the book jacket says this: a good cocktail is never a random concoction. I could say the same about a good book. In this case, tonight, we get a great book and two great cocktails. So without further ado, let me introduce you to Micah LeMon. Take it away, Micah.
Okay, can everybody hear me okay? Excellent. Okay. It's my pleasure to be with you guys again. I'm a full year into pandemic care and doing virtual cocktail classes. It's my pleasure to be with you guys tonight. I'm feeling a little tranquilo tonight because I just got my second vax shot. So I'm going to try to bring the energy for you guys. But yeah, feeling a little fuzzy tonight. So tonight we're going to be making two famous whiskey cocktails, the Old Fashioned and the Mint Julep. And you know, when I suggested doing these two cocktails, I really didn't have too much of an agenda. And some of the research that I uncovered when, you know, learning about these things really was mind-blowing. And so I'm very excited to share that with you tonight. But I thought while we're talking about cocktails, we should be enjoying one. So I thought we'd make our first cocktail of the evening Old Fashioned. So I'm going to start by, so our Old Fashioned cocktail is just kind of three basic ingredients. You got some whiskey, you've got some sugar, and you've got some cocktail bitters. And I like to put just a little bit of orange peel in mine. Some people put an orange wedge in there with a cherry. I don't like the kind of aesthetics of things floating in cocktails. It's just kind of not my thing. And I feel like you get a little better control with just the orange peel versus the orange wedge. So we're going to start here just with a little bit of orange peel. Okay, and we're just going to bruise this gently in the bottom of our tumbler with a muddler. Great. And then we're going to take 2 ounces of bourbon whiskey here. I've got some Elijah Craig. This is going to be the spirit base of our cocktail. Add it right in there. We're going to add a 1/2 ounce of simple syrup. That's going to be our sweet component. Right. And then we're going to add 2 dashes of Angostura bitters here. Now at this point, our cocktail is pretty much perfect. We can jazz it up with the addition of some complementary bitters. So you might do some orange bitters. At the Alley Light, I make a cherry sassafras bitters. So I'm just going to add a few drops of that. And then we're going to add some ice here. One more cube here. We'll give this a stir here for about 10 or 15 seconds. Great. And we're done. So if you guys have been on our previous classes where we've made things like the daiquiri, the whiskey sour, the Negroni, and other cocktails, you may have noticed that we didn't use a cocktail shaker. We just built our cocktail in our glass. And part of the reason for doing that is that the old fashioned is a really old cocktail. It actually predates the use of ice. We'll talk about that. And so because it's so old, we kind of build it just out of a nod to tradition directly in the glass. I got a couple questions from you guys. I thought we'd answer just a few right off the bat that pertain to the old fashioned. One of you guys had asked if we can make either one of these cocktails tonight as a mocktail. That's kind of difficult to do because both of them are spirit forward cocktails. The spirit is the main base. It's the main quantity of volume in the cocktail. There are other cocktails that are much easier to make as mocktails. Mint Juleps and old fashions are a little difficult. So I'd look to another cocktail to turn into a mocktail. One of you guys had asked if we could make this into a keto cocktail, which I'm guessing kind of means no sugar. If you want to do that, that's totally fine. But I've mentioned this in previous classes. Cocktails are a balance of spirit, sweet, and sour bitter. So if you take out that sweet component, it's just going to be a little out of whack. And if that's how you want it, I'm happy to make that for you. But I'm probably going to try to talk you into a little bit of sugar if you come into the restaurant and want me to make you an old fashioned. Got a question from Harrison Hart. Is there a perfect number of the amount of bitters dashed into an old fashioned? I'd say somewhere in the ballpark of 2 to 4 dashes. And then we got a question from Nelson Kale. What is your practice in using locally distilled spirits such as the all caps wonderful Ragged Branch? Ragged Branch is a good product. I appreciate your enthusiasm for locally produced spirits. That'll work just fine in an old fashioned. So let's get started talking about our cocktails here. So we're going to start off by talking about what Virginia was like. We're affiliated with the University of Virginia. I went to graduate school there. I spent all my life in Virginia. I grew up in Richmond, in the Tidewater area, and spent most of my adult life in Charlottesville. And in preparation of writing my cocktail book and for doing lectures, I read a book by a VCU historian about colonial drinking habits, specifically in Tidewater, Virginia. And one of the more interesting things from this book was that this historian mentioned that early colonists drank between 6 and 9 fermented beverages a day. And that might seem like a lot to us, but you kind of have to think that, potable drinking water really wasn't a thing. And if you wanted to have any quantity of liquid that would not make you sick, it probably contained some amount of alcohol because it was a fermented beverage. And there wasn't very much a big problem with drunkenness at that point in society, because these were low alcohol drinks that were consumed throughout the day. And it's also worth considering that these people were English colonists. They came from England, whereas a society that really embraced drinking, and not embraced drinking socially, but also like from a health perspective. If you went to the doctor in the 1700s, the doctor might say you're not feeling well. Well, are you having enough to drink? And that might sound kind of silly to us, but you see this surviving even into the early 20th century with, United Kingdom ads for Guinness saying, have a pint of Guinness for your health. So there's a pretty liberal attitude towards drinking in English culture. And even the Puritans, I found this really fascinating. The Puritans described alcohol as, quote, the good creature of God. We think of those guys as pretty uptight, abstemious people, but they also liberally drank. So distillates were very scarce in the early days of the colonies for a number of reasons. One, they required an excess of fruits or grains, some kind of starch source. They also required some specialized equipment, a distillation apparatus that usually needed to be made out of copper, which was a precious metal. And they also needed knowledgeable distillers, which were in short supply in the early days of the colonies. This starts to change in the 1700s. You start to have some economic development that leads to both some starch surpluses and to the introduction of some distillation equipment that makes it a little less difficult. And then you have an influx of Scots-Irish immigrants in the 1700s who especially know how to distill. They made whiskey in Scotland, subsequently Ireland. When it came over to the colonies and to the United States, they started making grain distillates. They started making whiskey. And I'm guessing a lot of you guys are local, and I know that because of the settlement patterns of Scots-Irish people, do we have a lot of Scots-Irish people on the call? Yeah, okay, I see a couple hands there. Yeah, so these guys basically introduced whiskey into the United States. And it's also worth pointing out that that whiskey, especially in the 1700s, was considered to be there were high class beverages and there were low class beverages. We know about the English that they're very obsessed with class and royalty and so on and so forth. And the distillates that were high status were things like rum and brandy. And people who came from wealthy families like Thomas Jefferson and George Washington, they liberally drank rum and brandy. Also, they enjoyed European things like Madeira, port wine, and French wine. To a much lesser extent, they consumed whiskey. So going into the 1800s, whiskey becomes especially ubiquitous, partly because of the westward expansion of the United States. You've got kind of into the breadbasket where you're starting to produce all these grains of corn, wheat, and barley. And you've got kind of a logistics challenge of how do you get all of that to Eastern markets? So say you've got 500 bushels of corn, you need to get that to Richmond, Virginia. The easiest way to do it is to ferment and distill that into whiskey barrels that can fit on a single wagon load instead of on 50 wagon loads. So we start to see a lot of especially cheap whiskey coming into the United States in the 1800s. And I thought this was a really interesting thing. In the early 1800s, whiskey is cheaper than wine, beer, coffee, tea, and milk. And I thought that the whole comparison to a gallon of milk being much more expensive than a gallon of whiskey was especially interesting. Because if you think about a gallon of milk now costs like $5 or $6, a gallon of whiskey is 5 bottles of whiskey. That would mean that like a bottle of Jim Beam in today's money would be less than $1. So you can see we're about to have kind of a societal problem if you've got a liberally drinking kind of populace, and then distillates are introduced into the culture, and these distillates are between 4 to 20 times more potent than what these people are ordinarily drinking. And so we start to have some kind of acute abuses of drinking too much. And this is not a lecture on not drinking too much. This directly pertains to the history of the old fashioned. So have any of you guys seen the Ken Burns documentary on maybe any? No, maybe a couple of you guys. It says that especially early in the 1800s, you have an acute abuse of alcohol, especially people drinking too much whiskey. And Dana, would you like to cue that first photograph that we've got of dudes passed out in front of? Great. So this is a photo from a little later in the 1800s, but it's kind of illustrative of people drinking too much. And these guys are on the nose. They're passed out under a sign that says Kentucky whiskey. And this was another stat that really kind of blew my mind in reading about this. The year 1830, as far as we know, the United States in the year 1830 was probably the hardest drinking society on record, even in modern times. And the average US adult was drinking about 1.7 bottles of spirits, mostly whiskey, a week. And that stat is a little deceiving because mostly the people that were drinking were men, to a lesser extent women. And there was a big section of the population that were teetotalers. So that is probably much more like 2+ bottles of spirits every week. And, I certainly enjoy drinking whiskey, but, even for me, that does seem like a lot. And then just to put that into some modern perspective, the most bibulous country in the world right now is Belarus. And Belarus only consumes about 2/3 of what Americans consumed in the year 1830. So what were they drinking? How were they taking this whiskey? They were having this really Spartan beverage that they called sling, which was just whiskey with just a little bit of sugar and some water. And people were very liberally drinking this stuff. And there were some societal problems. If you've got a bunch of people that are really drunk, some of them are going to be rowdy, some of them are going to be violent. So you start having problems with domestic and spousal abuse. And you've also got problems. You've got people with a big segment of the society having a chronic hangover from regularly drinking too much. And so medicinal bitters emerge as a product that is marketed towards, curing what ails you, especially being hungover. And so, people in the early 1800s, in the late 1700s, they had too much sling the night before. They start their day and they had a little hair of the dog in the form of sling, whiskey, sugar, and water. And then they add some of this medicine to help their headache. And we have the first cocktail being born. And Dana, would you like to cue that photograph of the New England Gazette there? So we see that the cocktail appears in print, this term cocktail referring to a mix of spirit of any kind, usually whiskey, sugar, water, and bitters. This appears in 1806. So it's pretty interesting to me that the old fashioned is at least 215 years old. And, when something appears in print at this point, it's probably been around for a while. So this cocktail is probably, closer to around 225 or even 250 years old. And really the only main change is that this cocktail has experienced over time is that it's primarily made with whiskey instead of just kind of spirit of any kind. And it also gets ice, which we'll get to in just a second. We did have a question from Samantha Wetzler. Said, do you make an old fashioned with with rye or bourbon? That's a good question. I'd say contemporarily, usually you're making old fashions with bourbon just because that's kind of, how things have panned out. You could make it with rye, it'd be totally fine. And, if you wanted to split hairs, you could point to this historical mention of, spirit of any kind, sugar, water, and bitters. So you could make technically an old fashioned with rum or with brandy or with, just about anything you can think of. So we mentioned that this cocktail, really the only change is the addition of ice. And ice appears in cocktails in the years immediately following this print in 1806. And one thing I'd like to point out is that we mentioned this mention of cocktail is from a New England Gazette. It appears that the cocktail, as we know it, came out of New England, and it didn't necessarily spread into the South until a little bit later. So where do we get ice for our cocktails in 1806, before refrigeration, before electricity? We get it from, Dana, you want to cue the next photo? Yes, that guy. We get it from this guy. This is Frederick Tudor. Frederick Tudor is a guy who grows up in Boston in the 1700s. And he sees a cycle of extremely cold winters where he lives in Massachusetts. And he sees people cutting blocks of ice out of lakes. And if you want to cue the next photo of people cutting blocks of ice out of lakes, Dana, there you go. He sees people doing this, and he has this idea. So people were basically cutting blocks of ice out of lakes, putting them in an ice house, and then using them, to keep stuff cold in the summer months. Frederick Tudor was one of the first people who had the idea to commercialize this practice, and he wanted to harvest large quantities of ice out of these frozen lakes. He wanted to store them in ice houses in New England, and then he wanted to ship them to especially hot parts of the United States, especially places like Norfolk, Virginia, Charleston, South Carolina, New Orleans, and places in the Caribbean, and sell them to these cities in the summer months. And people thought that he was crazy, and they thought that this was an incredibly dumb idea to try to ship frozen water, in an era where you didn't have refrigerated ships. But and this is true, you can Google this. By 1833, this guy had totally revolutionized how people drank drinks, and his business was so successful that he was shipping ice not only to the U.S. South and the Caribbean, but transatlantically. And New England lake ice was the gold standard of ice in places like London and Paris. And in 1833, he even had a famous shipment of ice to Calcutta, India, which is, if you're kind of doing the math, that's across the Atlantic, around the Cape of Africa, across the Indian Ocean, and not only to the east of India, but upriver, where it's some of the hottest parts in India. So it's really amazing that this guy, through just sheer will and logistics, managed to make his business the way he did. And I've got one more photo of guys loading ice onto a truck. Dana, if you want to pull that up. This is from probably in the early 20th century, but the ice trade continued at least for 100 years until you had ice makers coming in the mid 20th century. So Frederick Tudor, if you guys, if you're affiliated with the Darden Business School or some other business school, you may have heard of this guy. He's famous for this quote, Frederick Tudor here. He who gives back at the first repulse and without striking the second blow and despairs of success has never been, is not, and never will be a hero in war, love, or business. So a pretty fascinating American guy. And this guy really revolutionizes how Americans drink. This is why we drink iced tea. This is why we drink iced water. This is why we have ice in our fountain drinks. This is why we have iced cocktails, is especially thanks to Frederick Tudor. Okay, so let's move on to our next cocktail. So Frederick Tudor introduced.
Micah, before you go on for a second, somebody asked, what's the name of the Ken Burns documentary? That's the one on prohibition, correct?
I think it's called Prohibition.
Yeah, I think so.
Yeah. Do you want to take it?
That a few years ago, right?
Yeah, I think about 10 years ago.
Yeah. Okay. All right. Thanks.
Sure. Any other questions while we're taking a pause here?
That's good for now.
Okay. Cool. So
All right, Micah,
yeah.
do you mind, can we purchase your cherry sassafras bitters if we want to make the imbible version? Is there a place where we can get it?
Sure. There's a recipe for it in the back, and if you want, if you don't want to make it, you can shoot me an email, and I can set up a sale for you. I'm happy to post my email in the chat box at the end of our talk here.
Thank you.
Yeah.
And we had one more question about old fashions. Curious if you can share about the Wisconsin brandy old fashioned history. Do you know that?
I don't. I would guess that. Yeah, just shooting from the hip here. I know that there's definitely a tradition of making. We saw from that first print of the word cocktail, you can make it old fashioned essentially with any spirit base. So it might be kind of a frozen in time, version of a cocktail, made with rum or brandy. I do know that part of the appeal of the Wisconsin old fashioned is that it's made with crushed ice, and it's also made with usually very inexpensive brandy. So I'm not sure if it's popular because it's like really cheap, or if it's actually historically continuous with the original versions of the old fashioned. That's a great question. I need to know the answer to that. Do you want to take anything else, or should we keep going? Okay, let's do it. Revolution talked about Frederick Tudor, iced tea, iced cocktails. So American bartenders start incorporating ice into cocktails. And a lot of these are just very, very simple versions of the things that were popular at this time, especially sling. So the Mint Julep is one of these early sling kind of iterations. And so here's where my research really came off the rails, and I just learned a lot of stuff that really just kind of blew my mind. So the Mint Julep is a distinctly Virginian beverage. I did not realize that. So one of the first mentions there's a couple mentions of juleps in literature, but there's not really a kind of a journalistic mention of mint juleps until 1793 in Norfolk, it being described as a tumbler of rum and water, well sweetened, with a slip of mint in it. And that's kind of what we would expect, right? Because rum and brandy are our high class, fancy distillates. So, makes some sense. We see in print an advertisement for iced juleps for the Wigwam Gardens in Norfolk in 1807. So just 1 year after the first mention of cocktail up in New England. And I should just mention, if you guys have ever been to the Alley Light, you probably noticed that making iced cocktails is a certain degree of work. So we've got to lug ice from our ice machine to our ice bins, dump it in. Those things weigh about 40 or 50 pounds. We've got to make several trips to fill those things up. We're shaking cocktails, we're stirring cocktails, we're smashing ice with a mallet and a little canvas bag. And we're also cleaving big chunks of ice, which weigh anywhere between 25 to 50 pounds into smaller cubes that we put into cocktails. If you kind of think about the logistics of making iced cocktails in Virginia in the early 1800s, you've got to get a block of ice from an ice house. And you guys remember from that earlier photo where you saw the guy unloading or loading that block of ice onto a truck. Those were the kind of blocks you're working with. So that block of ice probably weighs, I guess, at least 150 to 250 pounds. You got to be able to manage that so that either you can lug that into your tavern or you can cut a manageable piece off of that. You got to cut that piece once you get into the tavern into smaller pieces. And then if you're making a julep, you got to smash that with a mallet and a canvas bag. And it's a lot of work, right? This is, we've got an area of the world where we have most of the labor intensive jobs being put in the hands of people who are enslaved. You just can't make this up. All of these guys who made mint juleps, they were all Black Virginian bartenders. This is one of the craziest things about this I did not expect to find out. So one of the first, and I'd like to point out that this is the other thing that's really crazy about this is that not only were these Black bartenders making mint juleps that were incredibly labor intensive, they became celebrities for doing this. So one of the first famous Black bartenders to become famous for making mint juleps was a guy named Jasper Crouch. So Jasper Crouch, he described himself as a freedman, and it's unclear. The records for a lot of Black Americans in this time aren't really super great. So we're not really sure if he was born a freedman, if his parents were freed, or if he acquired his freedom through his earnings working in restaurants. But he described himself as a free man. And he was one of the most famous both chefs and mixologists, probably one of the very first kind of what we would think of as a celebrity chef or a celebrity bartender of the United States. So his biggest thing that he managed was something called the Buchanan Spring Quoit Club. And this strange word that I said, quoit, it's Quoit. Quoits is this kind of strange Victorian game where you take a metal ring and you throw it at a stake, and it's kind of like horseshoes. So this Buchanan Spring Quoit Club was known as being one of the most exclusive sporting clubs in the entire country. And it was catered by Jasper Crouch 2 times a month. And there were only 30 people in this club, and they included some of the most rich and powerful people in Virginia. And twice a month, they'd meet, they'd throw quoits, they'd eat barbecue, and they'd drink Jasper Crouch's mint juleps. And there's a historical record of Chief Justice John Marshall, who was one of the members of this Quoits Club, being late for dinner, and instead of going to shake everybody's hand, which was customary, he went straight to Jasper Crouch, got him to make him a mint julep. He shook hands with the julep and then talked to everybody else in the club. You get the impression that Jasper Crouch he's a celebrity of his day, and especially because of his ability to make mint juleps. So 2 of the guys that came in the decades immediately after Jasper Crouch in Richmond were 2 guys named Jim Cook and John Dabney. And let's see. Can you, Dana, can you cue the photo of those hotels there? So Jim Cook and John Dabney worked at this place, which is called the Ballard House and Exchange Hotel. And if you guys have ever been to Richmond, or if you're familiar with Richmond geography, this is kind of down at the bottom, just before you get to Shockoe Bottom, at the corner of 14th and East Franklin. And So Jim Koch and John Dabney ran the food and beverage program at the Ballard House and Exchange Hotel. And there's really no other way to put it other than that they were celebrities. John Dabney had a branded julep that was named after him. These guys were regularly featured in the newspaper. When the Prince of Wales came to North America in 1860, one of the things that made the biggest impression on him was coming to Richmond and having Jim Koch and John Dabney making him a mint julep. There's 300 words devoted to this account, which is much more language than's devoted to most of his other accounts of his travels in North America. So the Richmond Times describes John Dabney. Dabney is, quote, the cunningest compounder of beverages and the most skillful architect of pyramidal adornments and floral and fruity garniture. And Dana, would you cue that photo of John Dabney next there? So this is one of the only photos that we have of John Dabney. And this guy is just a truly remarkable individual. And I'd encourage you to read about him if this is something that piques your interest. These guys are just, it's really kind of tough to imagine, enslaved guys, being as big as celebrities as they were during this time period. And all 4 Richmond newspapers, which were, quote, white newspapers, mourned John Dabney's passing in 1900. Okay, so just a couple of things, and I realize, I am a white dude in the 21st century, kind of talking about enslaved bartenders in the 19th century, and some of my introspections might not, be super welcome. So I'm kind of asking for a little grace here, but seeing that we share the same profession and seeing that, I've been asked to talk about the history, I just want to kind of mention just a couple of things that I think make these men truly remarkable. First is that being a saloon keeper and working in a restaurant was one of the few professions that was open to enslaved people, where they could make money to take home. And it's kind of a crappy arrangement. The owner of the slave would essentially rent out the slave to the restaurant, and then the slave could take money home in the form of tips. And what's remarkable about these guys is that they were so good at their work that they not only became famous for it, they became financially prosperous from it, such that many of these guys were able to buy their own freedom and the freedom of their loved ones. And the other thing I think is really amazing is these guys not only had to be accomplished bartenders, but they had to be accomplished chefs. And there's really no modern equivalent of this. And if you watch, I think of like one of the greatest chefs, Jacques Pepin. You watch him make an omelet and you're just like, wow, this guy's a genius. And then there's a couple of videos of him online trying to make cocktails. He has no idea what he's doing. So it's really rare to have someone who has such a deep kind of knowledge of both food and beverage, and all of these guys from this time period who mastered the mint julep had this kind of skill set. And then the last thing I think this is the most remarkable thing. For me, at the end of the night, one of the biggest things to kind of brush off is being slighted personally or professionally. And for me, that kind of comes in the form of, people trying to steal something from the restaurant, people saying crappy things about you online, people balking at, compensating you fairly when you've, gone out of your way to make sure they have an awesome time. Or people coming up to you and saying something like, well, what else do you do? And I try to be charitable and say I work full time running an award-winning bar program at a James Beard nominated restaurant. What more do I need to do? And these men worked dining rooms day in and day out with serving groups of people who didn't regard them as equals. And they did that with such skill and such charity that they became celebrities. And I think that that's really the greatest, compliment that you can give these guys. Okay, so let's talk about the evolution of the mint julep here. So you see it being made with rum or brandy, no ice in the 1700s. It becomes ice in the 1800s. It goes from being a regional specialty of Black Virginian bartenders in the early 1800s to becoming a national specialty of American bartenders in the late 1800s. We start seeing it being made with whiskey more and more in the late 1800s. And then this is a very ironic twist of history. So a lot of cocktails, we've got Prohibition from 1920 to 1933, and then we kind of lose a lot of continuity of a lot of drinks in that window. And some of them get resurrected in very unlikely places. And the mint julep is definitely one of these. It gets resurrected in 1938 by the Kentucky Derby. And the mint julep becomes the official cocktail of the Kentucky Derby. And it's made, the official whiskey of the official mint julep is Early Times, which is ironic again because, we think of this cocktail being made with bourbon. Early Times is technically not bourbon because of how it's aged. And we don't see a bourbon being the official whiskey of the official mint julep until 2015, when Old Forester bourbon kind of takes that over. So wow, that was a lot for you guys to take in. That was certainly a lot for me to read about and to faithfully transmit to you guys. So let's just kind of put aside all of the racial and cultural appropriation of this beverage and just kind of look at the recipe of whiskey, sugar, and mint. My critique of this is that it's just an ice sling. And I think that we can make this beverage a little bit better if we introduce a balancing component to balance the sugar and alcohol in the cocktail. And part of the reason why I think that this cocktail has really resisted any kind of change is that it was one of the very first ice beverages. It was created in a part of the world with insufferably hot summers. And if, I grew up in Richmond, in Tidewater, and I spent much of my life in Charlottesville. And I can't imagine spending a summer without air conditioning. I did it once. It was awful. And I also can't imagine not having ice. And to be, in a time where like you don't have ice or air conditioning and it's 100 degrees outside and it's sweltering, and someone hands you an intoxicating, minty cup of ice cold beverage, this is going to take off. It's going to be fire. So I think that's one of the reasons why this cocktail has really resisted change. And also, I like to think that I know what I'm doing when I make cocktails, but every once in a while I'll try something and it won't work. So I was trying this whole month to make a good old fashioned cocktail or a good mint julep by adding some cocktail bitters. It just wasn't working. And my staff was saying to me, well, it's kind of okay. And, when my staff says that to me, they're incentivized to tell me how great I am. And so when they tell me that something's really not that great, then I know I really need to reconsider it. So I made a lot of iterations of mint juleps with a couple bittering accents. And some of the best versions I made were with Italian bittersweet cordials. And those would not have been available to people like Jasper Crouch, Jim Cook, or John Dabney. They were introduced much later in time, closer to the 1880s or 1890s. So I'm going to show you now my basic mint julep recipe. And I'm going to show you kind of the traditional way to make it. And then if you want to add a couple little accents to kind of balance the things in the cocktail, you're more than welcome to. When I make a mint julep for people that just has whiskey, sugar, and mint, people invariably tell me it's either too sweet or too boozy, which is kind of, what I would expect if this whole rubric of spirit, sweet, sour, bitter indeed is correct. Okay, so let's make this cocktail here. So I got a little julep cup. We're gonna take that, and I've got a bunch of mint here, and part of the reason why I wanted to make mint juleps in April is because the mint this time of year is just so unbelievably perfect. So I'm going to put a generous pinch of mint in here. And so some of the recipes that survive from mint juleps, especially from people like Jerry Thomas, they call for up to 12 sprigs of mint. So we're really talking about a generous amount of mint here. So, and I'm just going to bruise this gently in here. You don't want to muddle the bejesus out of this, because then it's going to get kind of grassy. And then we're going to take 2 ounces of some kind of barrel-aged distillate. So I made a bunch of these, and I made a lot of ones that weren't successful. And one of the ones that I liked the most was with Bullet Bourbon. Bullet Bourbon is a little different in style in that it's got a large quantity of rye in it. So it's very different than something like Maker's Mark or even Elijah Craig. So we've got 2 ounces of that. That's our spirit base. Then we're going to add 3/4 of an ounce of simple syrup. That's going to sweeten up our booze here. Now, at this point, this is essentially a classic mint julep. We've crushed some ice and swizzle it, which we'll do in a second. But I think that this cocktail can really benefit from just a little bit of bitterness in the form of some bittersweet cordials. So I'm going to add, in total, 1/4 ounce of bittersweet cordial. I'm going to add 1/8 of an ounce, which is a bar spoon of Fernet Branca. So Fernet Branca is kind of like got a minty, licoricey, wormwood kind of bittersweet flavor profile. And then I'm going to add 1/4 ounce or 1/8 of an ounce of Cynar, which is bittered by artichokes. It's kind of just like a real resinous, just straight, burnt caramel kind of bitter flavor. And then I'm going to add just a few drops of Peppermint Bitters. This is one of my favorite brands. And if you remember from making Manhattans with me, this is the same brand of Abbott's Bitters that I like to use. So here, we'll do 3 drops of that. If you're going to use Angostura in here, I would only just use 1 dash. The Ango can really kind of take over the mint and kind of, mute that just a little bit. Okay, so the next thing we need to do is we need to crush some ice. So I've got a little canvas bag here called a Lewis bag. I'm going to add some cubes to it. And a lot of you guys probably have some kind of function on your fridge where you can just, press a button and get crushed ice. That's totally fine too. Great. Now I'm going to crush this here. Good. Now we're going to fill this guy up. We're going to stir it here for just a bit. all of your classic mint julep recipes call for kind of swizzling this till your outside of your glass gets kind of frosty. And then we're going to top this up with a little more ice. Great. And then I've got kind of I've described this as a pluche of mint stems, and it's really a lot. And if you get a mint julep, part of the best part is this guy right here, because it kind of gives you a kind of a flavor on your nose to connect to your palate here. So we'll just put that in there. Oh, I need to cut this. Okay. And we'll get a straw in here. And there we go. We got a mint julep. And let me taste this to make sure it's yummy. Okay, great. Oh, that's really yummy. Okay, so I'm going to answer a couple of questions here you guys had submitted before the class. We've got a question from Tina Coate. How to best bring out the flavor of the mint besides muddling? I would just bruise your mint in your cocktail. Other ways of handling mint are a little technical. You could nitro muddle mint with liquid nitrogen, but then you'd need a lot of special equipment. You could also do something called spirit blending it, but then you need a spirit that's over 55% alcohol. So the best way to do it is just to bruise it in a tumbler if you're making mint julep. If you're making a shaken cocktail, you can just throw it right in the shaker and shake it. We got a question from Jonathan Lowry and Elizabeth Friesen asking very similarly. Jonathan says, any ideas for interesting twists on the old fashioned? And Elizabeth says, are there any variations on these classic cocktails that you would suggest? Yes, especially with the old fashioned. There's a classic cocktail called the improved whiskey cocktail. It's something that we make for people all the time at the Alley Light. It's essentially a Sazerac and an old fashioned kind of mashup. So from the Sazerac, you've got absinthe and a lemon twist. From the old fashioned, you've got whiskey, sugar, and bitters. And then it's tied together with just a little bar spoon of maraschino liqueur. And then last question before we open it up here, Lori Vorath. I'm curious about the use of bitters. What are they exactly? How much should be used? So how much should be used? We kind of touched on this earlier with our old fashioned. If you're using them as your sole bittering ingredient, I would say somewhere in the ballpark of 2 to 4 or more dashes. What are bitters? We touched on this a little bit with medicinal bitters. Bitters are essentially kind of like a historical medicine. So they're an alcoholic infusion of medicinal herbs and flavoring herbs that have been historically used as medicine. If this really is something that piques your interest, I would definitely subscribe to the Alley Light on Instagram. We regularly have classes, a little less so during COVID. And I did a bitters class, I guess in 2019, which was really interesting. And I guess I didn't realize, one of the things I learned researching bitters is that a lot of the things that are in medicinal bitters have been historical bitters for thousands of years. And even today, alkaloids from those plants are still used to treat diseases like malaria and even things like cancer. So if that piques your interest, definitely check out our page here. So I am going to submit myself to your questions. I'm really hoping that I treated this subject matter with this is not easy stuff to talk about. And if I'd have known how difficult it would be, I probably would have picked a different cocktail other than the mint julep. But hopefully I did that with enough respect and grace that you guys can feel good about the conversation tonight.
I
So
think
Suzanne, you want to
Yeah, I think you did a great job with that, Micah. So
Okay.
thank you so much. I think you did great.
Okay.
We do have some questions coming in. So JW has a question about, can you ask Micah about Calvados versus cognac and what
Oh.
applications for Calvados in cocktails? Now, I remember JW had some great questions during our December event as well. So
That's an excellent question, because I almost used this in our mint julep. This is some Calvados that a buddy of mine brought back from France. I love Calvados. It's even better than grape brandy. Calvados is got just kind of a little more fruitiness to it. I love especially eggnog spiked with Calvados or apple brandy. Calvados is just so yummy. Yeah, you can make an old fashioned Calvados. You can make a mint julep with Calvados. You can make, most of your classic cocktails with Calvados. So, yeah.
great. So the next question is, when you bruise the orange peel, is it white side up or down?
The pith side up, so the peel side is facing down in the glass.
Are you using spearmint or peppermint?
Oh yeah, I'm sorry, I skipped over that question. I use spearmint, and I do like just a little accent of the peppermint bitters, just because without getting too technical, peppermint does have this kind of unique quality of kind of having like a toothpaste effect of making your mouth feel much cooler than it actually is, and also kind of like gives you a lot more of like a kind of perception of mintiness. So if you just used peppermint, it's just going to be too pepperminty. But spearmint is kind of what I generally use, and then just a little accent of peppermint bitters, I think is pretty great.
Okay, our next question. Do you use both, and I'm not going to say this right, Angostura or orange bitters in your old fashioned? And if so, how much of each?
Yeah, so in that recipe you posted, we did 2 dashes of Angostura. And then for the Alliolite build, we do 6 drops of this cherry sassafras. I've got that recipe in my book. A lot of people will use orange bitters in lieu of, some other, you just kind of want to have some Angostura, and then if you want, you can add something complementary to it. So.
Okay, everybody, keep your questions coming in. You'll see some other questions that were submitted before. Jonathan Lowry had a question about what can be done with vinegar shrubs.
Oh, right. That was tacked onto your other question. Vinegar shrubs are not my favorite thing. So vinegar essentially can act in place of sour or bitter as a balancing component. And so you can add technically vinegar to cocktails to balance things. And if you excuse me for just 1 second, my dog is photobombing my call here. Thanks. Sorry. So for me, vinegar really kind of is evocative of some beverage that has gone bad. And so I don't really like vinegar very much. I have colleagues that really enjoy using vinegar in cocktails, and I have had cocktails that I've liked with vinegar. But I would usually use them in conjunction with some other form of acidity like lemon or lime juice, and use them kind of in sparing amounts, just because, at least for my palate, the vinegar can really quickly overtake the other flavors in a drink. It just can kind of wash them all out. So yeah, my colleagues love making vinegar drinks. So if you come in on a Wednesday, Andrea will set you up.
What is your favorite bourbon under $50?
Oh man, I don't know if I have time to list them all off. I don't think you guys need to spend too much money on whiskey. So we're in a part of the world that has some of the most restrictive laws of calling bourbon whiskey. And so I mentioned this about early times technically not being called bourbon whiskey, and it's because early times is not aged in new American oak barrels. So anything that's called bourbon in the U.S., has a stamp of quality on it. So even really cheap stuff is pretty good quality. So some kind of nicer brands that I like, obviously Buffalo Trace, Eagle Rare, Elijah Craig, Bullet, and on the low end, even things like Ancient Age, which is made by Buffalo Trace. Henry McKenna is just fine. Jim Beam is totally fine. On the low end, there's a lot of really good values, especially if you're making cocktails with things. It's really not necessary to spend a whole lot of money on really, really fancy distillates just because of how strict the laws are in the US about calling bourbon. And it also explains why, as far as the globe, because you have all of these first fill American oak barrels being devoted to making bourbon. Once they're filled with bourbon, and once that bourbon goes out and is sold, you've got this barrel that still could be refilled and used and flavor other distillates, but it can't be used to hold bourbon. The early times example, so it gets shipped to the other parts of the world. So it's kind of interesting that the United States and especially American whiskeys have kind of a stamp on most other distillates around the world, because a lot of them end up in used American bourbon or rye barrels. So especially most tequilas are aged in American whiskey barrels, and rums are aged in the Caribbean are aged in American whiskey barrels, and even Scotch and distillates European whiskeys. I hope that answered your question.
Yeah. Okay. You know what? I realized we forgot to ask the poll question, which so maybe we can do that now. So Dana, could you cue the poll question? So we're just wanting to know which was your favorite beverage tonight.
Oh. Okay. I know that making a mint julep with all of my fancy add-ons is going to be expensive. So if you want to do that in the future, I'd encourage you to, fiddle around with that recipe and see if you can't find something that makes those cocktails equally yummy to you.
All right, great. So, all right, here's another question about bitters. Every single time, I think we have a lot of questions about bitters.
Yeah. Maybe we should have a bitters class. Maybe that should be.
Yeah, it might be so. So we have a lot of different bitters, but we don't have the Bob's flavor you recommended tonight. If you could only have 5 or so, what would they be? Is the question.
5 flavors of bitters. Angostura. I would have Peychaud's, Bob's Abbott's bitters. Probably get Reagan's orange bitters. Yeah, I mean, if we're gonna make mint juleps all the time, probably some Bob's Peppermint Bitters. And the reason why I'd say Reagan's orange bitters over Angostura orange bitters is just that Reagan's orange bitters is much more of a pure bitter. It's got orange flavor and it's got just a bracing amount of bitterness. This is really yummy, but it's a little sweet. So if you've got a cocktail that's perfectly balanced and you want to add just a little orange essence to it and just a little bitterness, this is going to make it too sweet. And the Reagan's orange is not. It's going to be perfect. So always be thinking about the balance of components in your cocktails.
Yeah, Sarah mentioned that she had all the add-ons, but she found the Mint Julep a bit too sweet with the additional bitters. So she's just going to need to modify that a little bit for her taste, it sounds.
Okay, I would say if it's too sweet, then you should add more bitter stuff or more booze.
Okay.
Or less sugar. Yeah.
All right. So in the questions that came in beforehand, there were a lot of questions about the muddling the mint, and you went into that a little bit because folks had mentioned that it comes out grassy or muddy. So you were very careful about how you muddled your mint. Did you want to get into that a little bit more?
Yeah, it involves some science. So if you, I guess the biological term is lyse. If you rupture the cells in these leaves, you activate polyphenol oxidases, which are enzymes that catalyze the degradation of some of the most volatile and essential molecules that you would associate with the fragrance of mint. So that's why you don't want to overly bruise it, because you'll activate these chemicals that basically make your mint flavor kind of disappear. So that's it in a nutshell. You just want to bruise it so that you can kind of get the flavor without, having it get too grassy.
Okay, great. So someone's asking, we saw dealer's choice on the Alley Light menu.
Ooh, yeah.
Would you serve if someone ordered that?
So when we do that, usually we ask people to, we don't, I should just zoom out. We want every person who comes in to be a happy patron. If the dining room is full of people who aren't getting what they want, then they're grumpy, and then that kind of grumpiness is poisonous to the dining room. So in a perfect world, we want everybody to get things that they want. So we try to get a little direction from our customers as, hey, maybe you pick a spirit base for us. You love mezcal, you hate mezcal, you love bourbon, you hate bourbon. Maybe pick a spirit and then kind of pick a direction. Do you like your cocktails a little more spirit forward? Do you like them a little more fruity? And then kind of maybe one other piece of information. And then usually we can make you something pretty yummy. But usually kind of want to know, are there any things that are off limits? Are you vegan? Are you, whatever dietary restriction you have? And, pick a spirit, pick a direction, and then we kind of make something fun for you. That's either, a proprietary recipe or a classic. So.
Okay, great. So Nancy Shaver asks, so what is your favorite signature cocktail to make for a group of 6 to 8?
Oh yeah, so I would recommend making a batch of punch. And I think we talked about this in one of our previous classes. Punch is actually a really old beverage. It was discovered. Well, I should say discovered. It was made by guys in southern India, and British sailors discovered these guys making this rum beverage with tea, sugar, citrus, and some spices. Brought this tradition of making punch back to Britain, and in the 1700s, making punch was kind of like the thing to do if you were a sporting person in England. And it's really easy. I've got a recipe for it in my book. You basically just make some tea, you peel some lemons, add them to some sugar, you toss them, and you get this oily, rich, lemony, simple syrup. You pour your tea over the peels, you strain out this flavored tea, lemony syrup. Then you juice those lemons, add the juice, and then spike it with some rum. And then you can put some spice on top. It's really yummy. You can customize it however you want. It's frequently made with rum or brandy. Again, these were the distillates of the high class in the 1700s, especially in England. You can make it with whiskey if you want. I would definitely recommend doing a punch. They're real crowd pleasers, and they're really yummy if you make them properly. And we also feature a punch at the alley light that rotates. Definitely worth checking out. Next time coming.
Okay, great. Josh said that you mentioned a book about colonial drinking, I think specifically in the Tidewater region.
Yeah, the book is called
Name of the book?
Every Home a Distillery, and I think the author's name is Sarah Meacham. She's a VCU historian. To be fair, it is a great source of information. It wasn't really a real page turner for me, but it was very informative in kind of getting a better picture of, how beverages, figured into the everyday life of people in the early days of the colonies, which, that's kind of a real mysterious period because, people don't really start writing about, cocktails until 1806. So there's really kind of we don't really know that much about, what people drank, before that. So.
Okay, regarding the punch, can you use a dark rum in punch?
Sure. Yeah. And I'd recommend using a blend of rums just because you get kind of more complexity. I mean, if you guys are familiar with tiki drinks are really kind of an homage to punch. Usually tiki drinks have some kind of like spice element. They have a split base of rums, they have some citrus, and then they've got some sweet stuff. So tiki drinks and punches are very kind of like kissing cousins. They're very similar.
All right, I think we're going to come in on one of our last questions here.
Okay, let's do it.
John Souza is an alum, wanted to get your take on whiskey coming out of Texas.
Oh, the only thing that we're getting in Virginia is Balcones, which is like 100% corn whiskey. It's just fine. It's good. I'd love to have some more whiskeys from Texas. I'm just not familiar with that many of them. Again, we have so many inexpensive whiskeys because of our laws in the United States of being so restrictive that it's really a tough market for people to get into because stuff like Henry McKenna in Ancient Age, they're super, super cheap, and it's just really hard to, undercut these guys with some kind of young product that's real expensive. So, this is a big hurdle for people like Ragged Branch. I think they've done a really good job of putting a quality product at a competitive price point into the market. But it's the whiskey business in the United States it's really difficult to get a price that that makes your product competitive and attractive. So.
Okay, great. So this is going to be our last question, Micah. People want to, can they sit at the bar at the alley light? So where are we now with
yeah, we're still not there. Yeah, we're still not there. We're still at 50% capacity. We're hoping that the next announcement from the governor we'll be able to have seating 6 feet apart. But I guess the thought is serving people directly at a bar might lead to some over imbibing and seeing historically how that's led to some bad things and some good things. Maybe it's a good idea not to do that exactly right now. But as soon as that happens, we'll definitely, as soon as we reinstitute bar seating, we'll definitely let people know. And if you follow us on Instagram, we'll be sure and let you guys know.
Okay, great, Micah. Well, we're coming up to our time, so I really want to thank you. Thanks for being with us when you're not feeling 100%. So.
Well, this talk was kind of a jolt tonight. So it was my pleasure to talk with you guys about these 2 cocktails. Again, I hope I did this with a modicum of diplomacy and respect. And I hope you guys have picked up some skills and some knowledge that will enhance your lives and your beverages.
All right, Micah, thank you so much. Really appreciate your time. And thank you to Suzanne as well. And for all of you for being with us. Our next Lifetime Learning event is on Thursday, April 29th, from 3 p.m. to 4 p.m. for a program entitled The Shadow Drawing, How Science Taught Leonardo How to Paint. Then my next one-day UVA event is on Tuesday, May 11th, from 2 p.m. to 3 p.m. for a program entitled The Politics of Food into Indigenous Communities. We'll be joined by 3 professors in UVA's Indigenous Studies Department, and they'll explore the foodways of an ancient Inca community and a Native American community in Oklahoma. So I hope you'll consider joining with me for that event. As always, you can find information about these events and many others, excuse me, at our Lifetime Learning website at alumni.virginia.edu/learn, as you can see on our screen. So in the meantime, please stay safe and be well. We're going to keep the program information on the screen up for a few moments. But for now, I want to thank you for being with us, and please enjoy the rest of your evening. Thanks so much.